The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The Englishman's Handbook by Idries Shah. 6. The Lights and the Dogs. Tea and curry. The British brought tea to India from China, and Europeans brought curry as a medicine from Central America. Chilies were unknown to us, and first mentioned here in the 16th century. Indian music, according to our own historians, is Western. It came from Greece. Unani or Ionian medicine is not native to us. The next thing will be the British selling us back our own antiquities. B.K. Sen. I was standing with my back to the warmth of the baked potato stall in Bermondsey Market, south of the Thames. It was pitch dark, not surprising in midwinter at 5 o'clock in the morning. All around was bustle in the huge open-air car park, not far from Tower Bridge, where the Caledonian Market is now held, as the stallholders unpacked, gossiped, gulped tea from vacuum flasks, and looked at each other's stock with the help of flashlights. I moved closer to a knot of men, surrounding a fat woman who was revealing, slowly and tantalizingly, one piece of jewellery after another, peeling off its many times used, crinkled newspaper wrapping. "Excuse me," I said, "what are you gentlemen doing?" At this distance the question and its phrasing sound maladroit, but at that time, on that freezing winter's morning, it was about as much as I could manage. I was trying to break into a layer of British society which, only a short time before, had been unknown to me. It felt very strange indeed, very foreign in comparison to, say, Bond Street. Not so far out if likened to the great open-air bazaar in Bombay, or even the one outside Budapest. Far better than the markets of Paris, Nice, or Amsterdam, which must explain why there are often so many continentals there on Fridays. That, and the fact that it is featured in most guidebooks and tours. German and Italian junkets are often organised to visit London for no other reason than to scour the markets. There was a light drizzle, and even my Afghan golden caracal fur cap was hard put to keep up with the local version of the British temperate climate, as characterised in all UK geography schoolbooks. You may be sure that Bermondsey, together with Covent Garden, are always the coldest places in London. Nobody took any notice of me at first, so I repeated my inquiry. "What are you gentlemen doing?" A huge, really tall fellow in a shabby, warm British Army surplus overcoat and with a beaten-up face like a boxer's — many people in London markets seem either very small or very tall — provided the reaction, if not the answer. He suddenly swung round and grabbed the collar of my Rohan-padded jacket. "Wouldn't you like to know?" he snarled. It was one of those moments which seem to pursue me almost wherever I happen to be, when I feel myself on the brink, not of the discovery I hoped for, but of some sort of imminent physical rearranging. Another man, clutching a handful of gaudy imitation pearl necklaces, flashed a light on me. I felt the surge of his garlic breath, blended with whiskey, against my cheeks. He grinned in the half-shadow. "Oh, lay off him," he said. "It's only Eddie the Persian." That was good enough. The burly man relaxed and let me go. "Hello, Eddie." He turned back to the jewellery. I was thankful that I had spent some previous daylight hours the week before in reconnaissance, following a friend's advice to get to know the geography and introduce myself to as many people as possible by a nom de guerre. I had spoken Persian to a Kurd in the market last time, and the Kurd's neighbouring stallholders had instantly manufactured my nickname. After that, I had sprinkled it around as I asked prices and admired the piles of silverware, ceramics, bric-a-brac, and sheer grot. In London markets, once people know your name, or the name you are using, they are at ease with you, up to a point. It's rather like the belief in some cultures, the Rumpelstiltskin theme, that knowing a person's name gives you some sort of hold or claim over them. I had created an unnecessary mystery, and I felt a certain amount of near suspicion in Portobello Road by telling some people that I was called Ebenezer McGillicuddy. Like a visitor to a faraway place, I had perpetrated an unintended discourtesy, broken a taboo, flouted convention. Some later said that they thought I was a grass, a police informer, others that I was from the tax office, and others that I must be up to something else, equally unacceptable or odd. The more charitable, or perhaps the more imaginative, even suggested that I was an eccentric millionaire or political refugee. In most other UK company, it is almost rude to ask anyone's name directly. Even if you say, trying to be elliptical in the English manner, "How do you spell your name? I've forgotten," they are liable to answer, "the usual way." It's almost as bad as asking people what they do. Young girls at posh schools are still told the cautionary tale of the lady at the cocktail party. She was asked, "What does your sister do these days?" The answer from Princess Margaret was, of course, "Still Queen, actually." In the world of London markets, it is not quite the same. It is almost as if you are with a different, slightly non-British tribe. There is a sort of non-English, yet English jargon spoken by some as well. If someone makes a call, you are likely to hear this reported as, "I rang him up on the telephone," as if one could ring up on anything else. Similarly, you may hear, "I thought in my mind," and "she is hungry in her stomach." If you are putting your goods out for sale in the market, you are stalling out. Goodbye is "see you later," however late it is. And the correct response to "be lucky" is not "whatever do you mean," but "thanks." Although British, the market people behave in a very different way from most others you meet. They are generally cheerful, even when things go wrong, though a few are grumblers and there are some monumental liars. They take up collections for people who are in trouble. They bring each other cups of tea and offer kind words and patience almost beyond belief. There is a kind of social service in operation. Go to Camden Passage on a Wednesday or Saturday, or to Portobello Road on a Saturday, and just listen. There you will find people grumbling or telling the same old story, year in and year out, while others listen politely and with every evidence of sympathy for the whingers. Everyone has done not too badly by the afternoon. Some have actually taken 7 grand before breakfast, and a few still feel that you must be from the mafia or the fuzz. In winter, few wear warm clothes, and I have not been able to discover why. A surprising number of them started in their trade by being collectors themselves, or merely market buffs. Bitten by the bug through just looking, they found themselves hooked. Perhaps the most amazing thing is that so many dealers know very little about the objects that they are selling. When one draws them out on some object, knowing full well what it is, they will invent the most elaborate origins, dates, provenances, without even superficial plausibility. I have stood watching this process going on, and I am sure that it is part of the cultural behavior of the tribe. The people asking the details don't expect to get accurate ones, and don't believe what they are being told. It's not facts, it's conversation. When I first went to the markets, spotting some Eastern antiquity whose origins and use I knew well, I used to offer a full and detailed description to the stallholder. After a bit, I began to notice that they were not listening, though standing in a polite posture and saying "ah" and "oh" at intervals, while they surveyed the crowd, combed their hair, or otherwise employed profitably the time I was wasting. Then someone explained, "Things are there to be bought. If you know what a thing is, you can buy it or not. What's with the details?" Some of the market people spend their winters in Thailand or the Bahamas. Others roar with laughter at the very thought that they could afford to get away even for a week. But on that day, some years ago, when I was pretty new to the market, when I had just become Eddie the Persian, I was in for a surprise never subsequently to be surpassed in my marketeering among the Brits. I had taken refuge in a cafe of the greasy spoon type, withered with cold, sitting with a hot chocolate at a table next to a small crouched group earnestly in converse. As I strained my ears, I distinctly heard the words, "I'll do what I can, mate, honestly, to get you in, but you haven't seen the lights. And the dogs." I was sure that I knew that voice. Slightly squeaky, it had that grammar school accent trying to copy public school plumminess. As usual, it sounded not like plums in the mouth, but like rather small cherries overlaying the South London intonation. But the small and stocky figure was a puzzle. He was dressed in quasi-Indian clothes, shalwar and gamis, which the subcontinentals have looted from Iran and Central Asia. His head disappeared into a Russian-type fur cap, and below it was a luxuriant, dark, greying beard. I couldn't quite place the man. Lights and dogs. So London markets were thieves' hangouts after all. My head was full of sensational newspaper accounts, constantly rehashed by the Sundays, of how burglars were making fortunes from raiding English country houses and sending priceless garden statues to Italy, pictures to America. Suddenly, people often seem to act suddenly in market circles. The rest of the time many appear to stand or sit almost motionless. The men got up and left the cafe. Only the exotically dressed little man remained. He moved over and sat down beside me. "Yes, I'll have a cup of tea and a couple of smoked salmon sandwiches, darling," he told the waitress. "And this gentleman will pay. He's a very old friend, a rich and famous Mexican writer. He won the Nobel Prize, not that you'd know what that was. Got the VC in the war and swam the channel 3 times each way. Quite a lad." I did a double take. I'd only ever met one person who talked like that. Yes, it was none other than my old friend George Archibald Fudge, whom you may have met in my The Natives Are Restless. The conman and abbreviationist extraordinary. "Fudge!" I cried with delight. "Where have you been, my old mucker?" "Not so loud, if you don't mind," he answered, "and not so much of the fudge." "Why not? And why the amazing clothes?" "Because I am now Raja Ankabut Fauji, Indo-Pakistani nobleman, antiquities re-exporter and jewel trader. Get a lot of stuff from sales at English country houses. People from British Raj days dying off, sell up. Indians prize such relics nowadays, even have their own collectors. Plenty of undeclared rupees sloshing about over there. More future in goods than in notes under the mattress, eh?" Yes, of course. I remembered how he had used abbreviations to convey meanings they were not intended to have when I was last in contact with him. How he had been CO, not commanding officer but conscientious objector, and so on, when I was researching the natives. After all, why not be Fauji? "Fauji," I said, "you really must do your homework. Raja is Indian, Ankabut is Arabic, and Fauji is Persian." "I have researched it. All these words are permissible in the subcontinent." "But not arranged like that." "Yes. In Bombay, where the Muslims, Parsis, and Hindus know next to nothing about their own faiths, where Arab traders have been going for centuries, and where Persian usages are common, many people speak only English. They do, however, deck themselves out at times with extravagant and such-like names. If you are from Bombay, why Indo-Pakistani? Family fled to Pakistan during the partition after the war. They were cloth merchants, so I grew up all over the world. Why bring in Pakistan? Because, dear lad, everyone in India or Pakistan can be identified and probably located both as to origin, family and status by reference to their home village, town or locality. So everyone has masses of relatives, except some people who fled to India or Pakistan from one of the other countries during the partition of the 1940s. A person could be the single survivor of an enormous family. I should have known better than to ask. He had done his homework. I asked him about the dogs and the lights. If it isn't a rude answer, Raja, what was all that about? Don't jump to conclusions, old boy. You may have thought that I was talking about difficult security arrangements, theft even. Perish the thought. In fact, I'm helping those poor fellows get work on a film set, where there is a movie in the making featuring tiresome dogs. The carbon arc lights, too, are somewhat onerous. All right, Raja, I believe you. Thousands wouldn't. Mind you, people don't dress quite like that anywhere, even in Bombay. I needn't have bothered. Of course, he always had an answer for everything. There's an old English saying, crooked logs make straight fires, isn't there? I asked Fauji to be my guide to the market. Tremendously delighted, old son. But what's your name hereabouts? Eddie the Persian. That's just great. But remember, there's quite a lot of Persians around. Can you speak the lingo? Like a native. Good. But where are you supposedly from over there? City of Mashhad. Identical dialect to the Afghan. Few of its denizens actually penetrate here. They tend to be rather religious. Fair enough. Pity you never took up on the con game. Might have made something out of you. Something of me? Such as ending up at 6 a.m. on a wet Friday in December at the age of nearly 70, dressed as an Indo-Pakistani? I was cold enough to think this nasty thought, but I am happy to report not quite cold enough to speak it. Fauji piloted me into the thick of the market. 3 women with American accents were crowding the gangway between 2 rows of stalls. They were speaking to the man in charge of a stall loaded with what looked to me like junk. He was a tall, sombre-looking fellow with a public school accent and a dirty raincoat. "Those Victorian vinegar bottles are just darling!" screamed one woman. Her duvet coat and blue rinse proclaimed transatlantic as loudly as her words. The conversation continued something like this. "Yeah, but he hasn't gotten any in lately, have you, honey?" said another. "Back in Texas, our little old store, we could make a killing if we could only get 'em," said the third. They bustled away, and I heard their raucous voices like buzzsaws in full operation a little farther off. Raja had paused and was slapping his thigh, though I couldn't see why. "Pity about the bottles," I said to the tall man. "I suppose you could have cleaned up there." Now he slapped his thigh. "Where'd you find this one, Raja?" he asked my friend. Raja wiped his eyes and turned to me to explain. "The point is, that was a little, very small-scale con game. They're doing what is called seeding in the trade. I don't mind betting that some accomplice of theirs has bought a stock of old vinegar bottles and can't get rid of them. So he's trying to plant the idea from one stall to another that a band of crazy American collectors is seeking them. Then he comes round selling the bottles." "But," I said, "isn't that a bit naive? I don't think that I'd be taken in by a trick like that." "But you nearly were, friend," said Raja, "and it will be played out a bit better than that. For instance, some of the less experienced, or greedier traders will take the bait and sidle about, asking for vinegar bottles, and will come upon someone who, amazingly, has a stack to sell." We moved on. Soon I was looking at 3 huge, dreadfully badly painted Indian pictures offered at £150. "Make me an offer," wheezed the aging asthmatic in the World War II flying suit, breaking off his attempts to date an alarmingly made-up, tiny, plump blonde of uncertain age standing nearby. "These are the throwouts of the ones which you get in Bombay for less than £5 each," I couldn't stop myself saying. "Just pay your fare to Bombay, see what they'll cost you then," shrilled the blonde. "Nah," said Flying Suit. "He's quite right. I bought 'em there myself a couple of weeks back. They was the throwouts." "Why do you price them so high?" I asked. "Listen, chum. First, I have to recoup my investment. Second, these pictures are not for the likes of you. They're for tourists, so shove over and give the real punters a chance. Their buses arrive about 7. As we walked on, Raja put his hand on my sleeve. "Listen, you got off lightly that time because he probably thought that you were a dealer or because he wanted to impress the blonde, but he might suddenly have turned nasty." "And attacked me?" "Worse than that. Refused to do business with you in future. Believe me, you often find bargains here. That's why there are so many dealers about. Now and again you see something underpriced, could be catastrophically on someone's stall. Not everyone can know the value of everything, that's where expertise comes in. If you've broken with him, he'll refuse to sell it to you. At the very least he, or she, won't give you a trade discount. You'd never survive behaving like that." "Is that why everyone always seems to be in such a good humour?" "Everyone gets on with everyone else, otherwise they don't last here. Call that humour if you like." I asked Raja where all this stuff, there seemed to be acres of it, came from. "Lots from house clearances. Executors usually strip out the valuable stuff. What's left, items of small furniture, cutlery, wall hangings, ornaments, bric-a-brac, less valuable silver and so on, is brought into the market by house clearers. They get paid for taking the stuff away, too." I had recently been attending sales at big London auction houses, Sotheby's, Christie's and the like. I told Raja, "One thing confuses me. Lots of these faces standing in front of what look like Totter's barrows, in the freezing cold, dressed in nothing special." "Well, I've seen these people, or lots of them, in 3-piece suits buying at Swiss auctions." Raja clasped me on the shoulder. "You've got it. You see, these boys and girls are often more knowledgeable than many upmarket dealers. They know more than the Burlington Arcade and Bond Street mob, so they can spot bargains that the bigger guys don't recognize without consulting reference books or specialists. Again, these markets are full of tourists from about 7 or 8 in the morning until 4 or 5 in the afternoon." "What about the tourists?" "Well, when you're travelling in a foreign country, do you go to a market to get an authentic old curio, or do you go to a posh auction? It all boils down to greed and atmosphere. You can often buy cheaper at auctions, but they haven't the atmosphere. It's the matter of selling not only the steak, but the sizzle of the steak." We stopped at a fast food stall. Most people at markets seem to spend a fair amount of their time eating. As we sipped the tasteless tea, I asked Raja why people so often seemed to know so little about what they were selling. A very snooty-looking individual with a hooked nose and tattered hat overheard and gave me the answer in a broad Irish accent. "Sure, and I'm never paid enough for what I know already. Why should I know any more? I'd love to earn commensurately with my education." I said to Raja, "How did you get on without any education at all?" He answered, quick as a flash, "I had to use my brains instead." At this point, someone nudged Raja and offered him a bundle of animal horns, Sanskrit manuscripts, and viceregal pictures. He hurried off to do business. After a couple of hours, as I dallied at one stall after another, I began to notice another inexplicable thing. Total strangers would come up to me. Sometimes they would take my hand and shake it cordially. One said, "It's old bronzes, isn't it? Well, I've something that may interest you." Another called out as I passed, "How's the new boat? Made any long-range trips yet? Must cost a bomb to run. Come over here and have a look." A third, "That lot you got at Bonham's, bet you made a packet on it. Must admire your taste and cheek. Here, I've got a couple of paintings I'd like your advice on." I was becoming desperate, since there was no way I could explain, without help, my sudden popularity and supposed recognition. Finally, I tracked down Raja, eating a hot dog on the Triangle, the space adjacent to the main market, which is run by private enterprise rather than by the local council. I said, "Raja, perfect strangers are coming up to me and shaking hands. What is going on?" "Perfectly simple, dear boy. I've passed the word around that you are kosher." That might explain the readiness to trade with me. It does not elucidate why everyone should imagine that I have a special interest in this or that. Raja nodded sagely. "Don't you see?" "No, I don't." "Well, here it is. They don't know and don't care what your speciality is. They think that by flattering you, calling you an expert on this or that, they will engender a warm glow, which will translate into your looking at what they're really selling. Few really specialize, so if you feel a sense of goodwill towards them as you look at their stuff, you may well buy something." Does it work? Sounds a bit far-fetched to me. "Listen, these are some of the best operators in London. Are they going to do something if it doesn't work?" Flattery will obviously get some people somewhere, in England as elsewhere. I wondered where all the treasures I saw piled high on the grubby stalls wound up. I was told that many items from boot sales, from small antique shops, from giant open-air events like those at Newark in Nottinghamshire, or Ardingly in Sussex, and from auctions, end up in huge containers bound for the United States or Japan. Germany is another major destination. The dealers say it's because many of its antiques were destroyed in World War II. Of course, some objects will later be found in Bond Street or Knightsbridge, as you might expect. But I discovered another incongruity. I'd always imagined that the quaint curio shops in England's countryside were packed with bargains from country houses. Packed they may be, but very many of them are stocked from London, and they are priced accordingly. Nor is it entirely true that the British are selling the family silver, as it were, following the eclipse of empire in the 1950s. The two major auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, were founded in the 18th century, before much of the British Empire existed. Rosemary Hill of the Sunday Telegraph found out some interesting things. A German commentator grumbled that Napoleon's troops were followed everywhere by a correspondingly warlike band of English antiques dealers. Almost everywhere among the trade, there are tales of the newly rich, Americans looking for family portraits to pass off as ancestors when they go back home. There is said to be a good trade in silver, which may be described as brought over on the Mayflower. It needs to have the right hallmark dating. This transatlantic tendency is said to date from the 19th century, and according to Ms. Hill's article, Walpole hung his armour on a dark stairway so that visitors would not notice its disparate origins, and hinted that an ancestor had brought it back from the Crusades. Now, Walpole was no 19th century arriviste American. True, he started as plain Mr. Robert, but he became Sir Robert and later Earl of Oxford, and in the 18th century he rose to no less a position than British Prime Minister. So perhaps the British had more part to play than they like to admit in teaching the American tourists in Bermondsey Market how to fabricate their origins. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.